My name is Clara. I'm 22 years old, and let me tell you, the sharpest agony I endured that evening had nothing to do with the fresh medical staples biting into my lower abdomen. It was the heavy sound of my own front door clicking shut. For a split second, I foolishly believed I had reached my sanctuary, a place to finally collapse and heal. Instead, I was immediately assaulted by a tone that felt less like a brother's welcome and more like a warden's lash. I had just been released from the surgical ward hours prior. My complexion was like chalk, my limbs heavy with exhaustion, and I navigated the hallway with agonizing caution because every tiny movement sent a jagged spike of fire through my core. The flimsy plastic of the hospital ID band was still scratching against my wrist, and the clinical stench of iodine clung to my clothes, a screaming testament to where I had just been. I had barely pressed my trembling palm against the foyer wall for balance before my older brother's voice aggressively sliced through the living room. "Well, how gracious of you to finally show up. Cut the dramatic limp and get dinner on the stove, right now." Derek didn't bother to ask if the procedure was a success. He didn't inquire if I was physically capable of standing upright. He didn't even bat an eye at the fact that I was taking shallow, ragged breaths just to keep from crying out. To him, I wasn't a sibling recovering from trauma. I was a defective maid late for a shift he believed I still belonged to. For a fleeting moment, my muscle memory took over. I almost did what a lifetime of conditioning had taught me to do: lower my gaze, swallow the stinging humiliation, and march to the kitchen. But then, a vital detail anchored me. I was not alone in that hallway. A man had stepped silently into the apartment right behind me, carrying the modest overnight duffel I had been entirely too weak to shoulder myself. He had stood there in the shadows, absorbing every single freezing, vile syllable. I didn't turn my head just yet. There was no need. I could physically feel the atmosphere at my back shift and crystallize. The silence morphed into something dense and incredibly dangerous, as if a predator of much higher caliber had just slipped into the territory and was quietly assessing its prey. Derek was completely oblivious. He had no idea that the most catastrophic blunder of his existence wasn't simply demanding a home-cooked meal from a post-op patient. It was making that demand in the immediate presence of the exact man who held the power to vaporize his entire livelihood. That evening initiated with the familiar physical torment and routine degradation I had weathered for over a decade. But before midnight, the hierarchy of power within those four walls would be violently upended, in a manner none of us could ever reverse. My brother's name is Derek. He is 6 years my senior, and for as long as my memory stretches, he treated his birth order like a royal decree, granting him absolute dominion over the household, over my personal time, over my physical autonomy, and most importantly, over my silence. Some girls grow up with an older brother who patiently teaches them how to balance on a two-wheeler or aggressively stares down the neighborhood boys who linger too long near the porch. I had Derek. Derek was the one who meticulously trained me how to apologize for offenses I never committed, how to tiptoe across the squeaky hardwood floors like a ghost so as not to trigger his volatile temper, and how to scrub the baked-on grease off his abandoned skillets, because silently doing his chores was significantly less painful than enduring an hour of his explosive rage. He possessed this terrifying knack for delivering commands as if they were universal laws of nature, acting as though my life's sole purpose had been preordained as his servitude, and the universe had simply neglected to hand me the memo. As I stood paralyzed in that dim entryway, the fresh medical staples pulling agonizingly under my cotton shirt, the heavy painkillers making the edges of the furniture soften and blur, my history with him didn't wash over me in a standard wave of nostalgia. It ambushed me in jagged, ugly flashes. Every intense throb radiating from my abdomen dredged another submerged nightmare up from the murky bottom of my psyche. I vividly saw my 12-year-old self, hands raw from hot water, kneeling on the scuffed kitchen linoleum, while Derek carelessly tossed crusty, unrinsed dinner plates into the sink, coldly informing me that I was a worthless waste of space if his dinner wasn't steaming on the table by exactly 6 o'clock. Another visceral stab of pain across my core. Suddenly, I was 16 again. I was standing in the living room, my knuckles white as I clutched a high school report card filled with honors grades, my golden ticket to academic scholarships. Derek had simply smirked, letting out a cruel, hollow laugh. He told me that girls like me never escaped zip codes like this. He promised me I would always be the background helper, never the main character anyone actually chose to invest in. Another sharp pulse of physical agony. And then I remembered being 19. I was working grueling double shifts at a local diner, my feet aching constantly, diligently stuffing wrinkled $20 bills into a rusted, vintage tea canister hidden in my closet because I was desperate to afford community college credits. Then, one Tuesday, the canister was empty. When confronted, Derek hadn't even blinked. He just gave a casual, dismissive shrug and claimed I must have misplaced it in my scatterbrained state. He never explicitly confessed to the theft, but I knew. I always knew. The most sinister aspect of his cruelty wasn't simply the acts themselves. It was how utterly ordinary he made the terror feel. He was a maestro at weaving psychological abuse into the mundane fabric of daily routine, until I found myself genuinely questioning my own sanity. Even after enduring years of this systematic breaking, some naive, childish fragment of my heart clung to the pathetic hope that he might magically transform. I kept waiting for the morning he would look across the table and finally see a human sister instead of an indentured servant. But having your body sliced open and stapled shut has a funny way of stripping away romantic illusions. Deep physical trauma does that. When your literal flesh has been severed and bound back together, you immediately stop making excuses for the people who spend their lives trying to emotionally butcher you. "Are you deaf?" Derek barked from the sunken cushions of the sofa. I said I'm starving. The previous iteration of Clara would have physically flinched first and processed the command later. But on this particular evening, I did absolutely neither. I remained perfectly still. I gently pressed one palm against the thick gauze over my stitches and purposefully allowed the heavy silence to stretch just long enough for it to crawl under his skin and irritate him. Then, I slowly lifted my chin and locked eyes with him in the exact manner I should have adopted a decade ago. I didn't look at him like he was a terrifying hurricane I had to survive. I looked at him like he was simply a mediocre man who had gotten away with far too much nonsense for far too long. He still hadn't registered the presence of the man standing in the shadows behind me. Derek honestly believed this was going to unfold like every other pathetic Tuesday night, a night where I dragged my bleeding body to the stove so he could gorge himself without lifting a finger. That is the fundamental flaw of bullies like Derek. They tragically confuse tedious repetition with permanent power. They assume that just because you absorbed their punches yesterday, you are contractually obligated to absorb them forever. They mistake your bone-deep exhaustion for blind loyalty, and they misinterpret your survival silence as willing consent. And when that silence is finally shattered, they have the audacity to act deeply betrayed by the mere sound of your voice. The man standing behind me very quietly set my duffel bag down on the entryway rug before stepping fully into the warm glow of the hall light. And for the very first time since I had unlocked the door, the arrogant mask on Derek's face slipped. It wasn't quite fear yet, but it was a very distinct, very sharp confusion. He rigidly straightened his posture on the couch, lowered the television remote, and narrowed his eyes into a suspicious squint. "Who the hell is that?" he demanded, not out of any genuine concern for my safety, but simply because he despised any variable in his environment that he couldn't personally control. I took one very deliberate, careful breath before delivering the answer. "His name is Harrison Vance," I stated calmly. "He graciously helped bring me home from the surgical ward." That statement was entirely factual, but it barely scratched the surface of the truth. Harrison hadn't been some random, benevolent passerby in the lobby. Earlier that afternoon, my official discharge had been flagged and delayed because a perceptive nurse was deeply concerned that I lacked a safe, supportive environment for recovery at home. By pure coincidence, Harrison had been walking through the surgical unit, conducting a site visit for a family foundation program his corporation heavily endowed. He wasn't a surgeon, and he wasn't on the hospital payroll. He was the executive chairman of Vance Hospitality Group, the massive conglomerate that owned 12 high-end restaurants, 2 luxury catering divisions, and the sprawling downtown boutique hotel where Derek had recently clawed his way up to assistant operations manager. I was completely unaware of his pedigree initially. All I knew in that hospital corridor was that this man saw me trembling as I tried to lift a cheap overnight bag, politely asked where my ride was, and quietly observed my expression completely crumble when I confessed I was taking a cab home alone because my only local family was too busy to be bothered. Harrison possessed a steady, piercing way of studying people that made telling polite lies feel utterly ridiculous. By the time we navigated to the parking garage, His intuition had already pieced together far more than I had spoken aloud. By the time his luxury sedan pulled up to my apartment complex, he had discreetly made 2 hushed phone calls from the driver's seat and bluntly asked me whether I genuinely felt safe walking through my own front door. I remember feeding him the exact type of rehearsed answer women are conditioned to give when they are desperately trying to minimize collateral damage. "It'll be fine." Harrison had glanced over at me, his gaze lacking any pity but full of sharp understanding, and murmured, "In my experience, people usually say that exact phrase right before they are forced to describe a situation that isn't fine at all." During the suffocating elevator ride up to my floor, he didn't pry for ugly details. He simply positioned himself close enough to catch me if my legs gave out, yet far enough away to ensure I didn't feel trapped. That subtle display of restraint carried more weight than he probably realized. Now, he stood exactly 3 feet inside my living room, his tailored overcoat still securely fastened, his expression a completely unreadable mask of absolute authority. Derek got to his feet with a sluggish, deliberate motion. That was exactly when his smartphone vibrated violently against the glass coffee table. He glanced down, annoyed, and the muscles in his face immediately calcified. Even from where I stood, I caught the distinct corporate logo of Vance Hospitality flashing across his lock screen notification banner before he hastily shoved the device into his pocket. The timing of that alert was so chillingly precise, it felt less like a coincidence and more like a lit match being casually flicked onto a pool of gasoline. "You work for his company?" I blurted out before my brain could filter the words. Derek shot me a venomous, silencing glare, but Harrison answered in my stead. "He is currently employed at one of my downtown boutique properties," Harrison stated, his voice as smooth and cold as polished marble. "Though, after witnessing the display I just walked in on, I highly suspect that employment arrangement is about to become exceptionally complicated." Derek forced a laugh, but it was a thin, brittle sound that practically cracked in the stale air. "Look, buddy, this is my family," he sneered, puffing out his chest. "You don't get to just waltz into my private home and pass judgment on a private sibling conversation." Harrison didn't bother to raise his voice. "When you hold all the cards, you never need to shout. A private conversation," he repeated, rolling the words around as if tasting something rotten. "You barked orders at a young woman who just returned from major abdominal surgery, demanding she stand over a hot stove while she is visibly pale and trembling in agony. That is your definition of a private family matter?" The thick vein pulsing in Derek's neck visibly bulged. He absolutely abhorred being corrected or reprimanded in front of an audience, but having it done by a man whose mere signature could financially ruin him was an entirely different level of hell. I could actually smell the sour scent of nervous sweat beginning to bleed through his expensive, over-applied cologne. I could hear the subtle, frantic shift in his respiratory rate. The atmosphere in the living room didn't just feel generally tense in a dramatic, movie-like way. It felt clinical, precise, surgical. It felt exactly like a massive, rotting lie being carefully sliced open on an operating table under blinding lights. Harrison pivoted his shoulders slightly, directing his full attention toward me. "Clara, are you the primary name on the lease for this apartment?" That simple, quiet question slammed into me with more concussive force than Derek's loudest screaming matches ever could, precisely because it excavated the very truth Derek had spent years desperately trying to bury under piles of intimidation. "Yes," I answered, ensuring my voice was steady. "My aunt helped me co-sign the paperwork when I turned 21. My credit score was significantly better than his." Derek's head snapped toward me, his eyes wide with a frantic, cornered energy. "Why the hell are you saying it like that matters?" he spat. But Harrison's piercing gaze never wavered from mine. "Because it matters a great deal," he stated with absolute finality. "And because parasitic men who financially depend on the very women they chronically disrespect usually bank on their victims being far too ashamed to admit who actually keeps the roof securely fastened over their heads." For the very first time that entire evening, I witnessed an entirely raw, unfiltered emotion physically rip across Derek's face. It wasn't his usual explosive rage. Not yet. It was pure, unadulterated fear. Before Derek could scrape together a coherent defense, the shrill chime of the doorbell shattered the tension. This wasn't some random, neighborly interruption. An hour prior, while still fighting off the heavy fog of anesthesia in recovery, I had managed to type out one fragmented text with violently shaking fingers to the only person who had ever listened to my truth without demanding I showcase every invisible bruise. Come tonight if you can. I think I am in trouble. Her name was Rachel, and if fierce, unconditional loyalty took a human form, it would look exactly like her standing in my dim hallway. She was balancing a steaming paper bag of takeout broth in one hand and clutching a heavily stuffed manila envelope in the other. The very second her eyes landed on my pale, pain-stricken face, her demeanor instantly shifted from anxious friend to cold-blooded executioner, not screaming furious. Clinically, terrifyingly focused furious. She stepped over the threshold, swiftly surveyed the positions of me, Derek, and Harrison, and accurately deduced in under 3 seconds that she had walked into a war zone. "You need to be horizontal," she murmured softly to me first, treating me like fragile glass. "She belongs in the kitchen," Derek muttered, desperately attempting to claw back a scrap of his shattered authority through weak, pathetic mockery. Rachel turned her full attention to him with the kind of absolute, predatory stillness that generally provokes weak men into making fatal mistakes. "Did you genuinely just let those words fall out of your mouth while she is literally wearing hospital tape on her arm?" she asked, her voice dangerously level. Derek rolled his shoulders, feigning a tough, unimpressed posture. "And exactly who are you supposed to be?" "I am someone who knows significantly more than you ever accounted for," she stated flatly. Then, she deliberately lifted the thick envelope an inch, a hell of a lot more. I stared at the worn yellow paper. Rachel and I had been painstakingly sifting through my disorganized financial records for weeks because there were glaring, undeniable gaps. The emergency cash I had desperately hoarded for my procedure. Money that had magically evaporated in random, untraceable chunks over the past 12 months, whenever Derek casually claimed the electric bill was critically overdue, or some catastrophic emergency at the hotel, required him to borrow my debit card until next Friday, a Friday that predictably never arrived. I had eventually stopped interrogating him because he delivered his lies with such aggressive, unblinking confidence that I ironically walked away feeling guilty for questioning his integrity. But Rachel never, ever forgot a discrepancy. She possessed the icy patience of an auditor who understands that the truth doesn't require screaming, it only requires an irrefutable paper trail. She had systematically noted transaction dates, meticulously photocopied crumpled receipts, aggressively archived deleted screenshots, and logged every single pathetic excuse he fed me word for word. "Clara texted me from the recovery room," Rachel announced, deliberately setting the takeout container onto the kitchen island. "She sounded terrified, so I decided to bring chicken soup and an extensive reality check." Derek scoffed loudly, but my eyes caught the involuntary rapid twitch of his right index finger. "A reality check for what?" Rachel offered a casual, devastating little shrug. "Oh, just the standard reading material. Bank transfer confirmation numbers, a certified copy of the digital rent ledger, 2 suspiciously large wire withdrawals routed directly from Clara's medical savings into your personal checking, 1 direct deposit to an offshore online sports book, a final past due notice from your platinum credit card." She paused, deliberately tapping her fingernail against the manila flap. "And a formal disciplinary warning from your employer that you conveniently forgot to mention at Sunday dinner." Derek lunged forward half a step, his face mottled red. "You illegally dug through my private property?" "No," Rachel replied, her voice ringing like a bell. "I legally dug through Clara's financial statements after she tearfully asked me why she was suddenly $3,000 short for her post-op physical therapy. It's truly fascinating where the digital breadcrumbs lead." Harrison remained completely silent by the door, but I watched his sharp eyes track the exchange. He was mentally logging every single syllable, every damning implication. Derek's gaze snapped back to me. He wasn't radiating his typical explosive anger. Instead, he looked completely and utterly exposed, which for a narcissist like him was infinitely more excruciating. "You deliberately invited an audience here tonight just to humiliate me?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "No," I replied, and the absolute steadiness of my own voice startled me. "You orchestrated your own humiliation. They are merely sitting in the front row watching it happen." Rachel took a protective half-step closer to me, not physically shielding me, but grounding my energy. "There is actually one more item on the agenda," she stated cleanly. "You tell him, Clara, or I will read it aloud myself." My throat instantly constricted because I knew the exact financial atrocity she was referring to. 6 months prior, when the specialist first mandated the invasive procedure, I had quietly opened a secondary high-yield savings account under a maiden name Derek had no knowledge of. Or, so I naively believed. The brutal week right before my crucial pre-op consultation, nearly $3,000 evaporated into thin air. It wasn't siphoned off in careful, untraceable increments. It was a massive, paralyzing hit that made me genuinely question if I had hallucinated making the deposits. It was a theft severe enough to forcibly delay my vital surgery by 2 agonizing months while I begged the diner manager for extra shifts, surviving solely on instant ramen and over-the-counter painkillers. Rachel had meticulously mapped the data. Derek had been quietly siphoning funds in amounts just small enough to fly under my exhausted radar, then expertly camouflaging the missing cash by fabricating fake utility crises and layering on extreme emotional pressure. He blatantly stole from me. I finally forced the words out, and the air in the apartment seemed to vacuum seal itself. And it wasn't an isolated mistake, it was systemic. He drained the very account explicitly earmarked for my surgical recovery. Rachel turned her lethal gaze directly onto Derek. "And I am fully aware of exactly what you pulled when she was barely 18, too," she added softly. For the very first time all evening, the sickly flush of anger completely drained from Derek's face, leaving behind a terrified, ashen gray. Years ago, playing the role of the desperate, ambitious older brother, Derek had aggressively guilt-tripped me into co-signing a high-interest personal loan, swearing on our dead mother's grave that he needed the capital for a mandatory management certification, and promising he would auto-draft every single installment. He completely defaulted on the first 3 payments, utterly nuked my fledgling credit score, and then spent the next Thanksgiving dinner loudly complaining to our extended family about how financially irresponsible and immature I was. I had sacrificed the better part of 5 years desperately trying to repair the catastrophic damage he inflicted on my financial identity. I had never told another living soul about the loan, because deep systemic shame is brilliantly designed to keep you silent. But Rachel knew. And now, the terrifying executive standing by the door knew too. The physical dimensions of the living room felt claustrophobic, but paradoxically, I didn't feel small anymore. For the first time in my adult life within those walls, every toxic secret Derek had weaponized to keep me submissive was being dragged kicking and screaming into the harsh overhead light. Derek reacted exactly how manipulative men invariably react when their meticulously constructed reality collapses. He immediately attempted to pivot into a theatrical performance. He let out a loud, incredulous bark of laughter, threw his arms wide open, and looked beseechingly at Harrison, attempting to frame the entire scenario as a hysterical, hormone-driven misunderstanding manufactured by overly emotional women. "You cannot possibly be taking any of this seriously," Derek scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically. "She acts incredibly dramatic whenever she isn't the center of the universe. And her little friend over there just constantly feeds her delusions. That's literally all this is female drama." I analyzed him intensely in that moment, observing him with the detached curiosity of a mechanic watching a severely broken engine spark and smoke while the driver aggressively insists it's running perfectly. His volume was dialed up to 10, but his physical tells betrayed massive internal panic. His fingers were opening and closing spasmodically. His shoulders had entirely lost their arrogant, entitled swagger. He was no longer debating from a platform of undeniable authority. He was debating from a place of pure, desperate panic. "Do I look like I'm being dramatic to you right now?" I asked quietly. He completely ignored my existence, speaking directly over my head to Harrison, maintaining the illusion that I was still too insignificant to warrant eye contact. "Look, you run massive luxury hotels, 5-star restaurants, a giant corporate machine, right? Then you, as a businessman, understand that people constantly blow petty family squabbles massively out of proportion. Clara has always been pathetically sensitive, and she gets a sick thrill out of painting me as the villain just because I refuse to coddle her." Harrison very slowly tilted his head, studying Derek like a particularly repulsive insect pinned to a board. "In my professional experience," Harrison murmured, his voice deceptively soft, "men who deploy the word sensitive when they are finally confronted with their own undeniable cruelty are almost always attempting to discredit the key witness, rather than addressing the actual problem. Rachel let out a sharp, genuine laugh at that observation. Derek instantly pivoted his aggression toward her, realizing Harrison was a fortress he could not penetrate. "And you," Derek snarled, pointing a trembling finger, "you've been obsessively trying to brainwash her and turn her against her own blood for years." Rachel calmly folded her arms across her chest. "No, Derek. I simply wanted her to stop apologizing for surviving your abuse." That single sentence landed in the room with the concussive force of a physical blow. I literally saw his posture flinch. For over a decade, Derek had successfully controlled the family narrative by aggressively framing every single natural reaction I had as irrefutable evidence of my mental instability. If I broke down crying, I was accused of being manipulative. If I withdrew into silence, I was branded passive-aggressive. If I finally found the courage to confront him, I was labeled disrespectful and insane. There was absolutely no acceptable version of my existence that didn't position him as the long-suffering victim. But tonight, the intricate pattern of his abuse was finally glowing in neon lights. Not just visible to me, but exposed to two highly capable witnesses he could not bully, gaslight, or manipulate into self-doubt. "Tell him about the property management emails," Rachel instructed quietly, her voice cutting through the stifling air like a scalpel. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to maintain eye contact with Harrison, because delivering the brutal truth felt strangely easier while anchored to his absolute, unshakable calm. 3 months ago, I began, my voice steadying, I discovered Derek had been secretly contacting our building's leasing office. He fabricated a narrative that I was the sole reason the monthly rent was constantly delayed. He officially documented that I was financially reckless, completely unstable following my medical episodes, and deeply in need of his constant, gracious supervision. Harrison's facial muscles tightened imperceptibly, transforming his expression into carved granite. Were any of those statements legally factual? Absolutely not, I stated firmly. I have covered the lease almost every single month. I am the primary leaseholder. He literally funneled my electronic bank transfers through his account to keep the ledger from defaulting, then paraded around the management office playing the long-suffering savior. Rachel didn't miss a beat. She reached into the manila envelope and physically placed the printed transfer receipts directly into Harrison's outstretched hand. Seeing the undeniable proof, my account numbers, the exact timestamps resting in the hands of a corporate titan, felt utterly surreal. Derek lunged forward. "You have absolutely no legal right to look at those." Harrison simply raised one open palm. Derek froze instantly. Not out of respect, but out of a primal instinct warning him of extreme, immediate danger. As an executive chairman, I possess every conceivable right to review documentation when one of my management-level employees appears to be actively engaging in systematic theft, psychological harassment, and potential financial fraud against a highly vulnerable tenant recovering from major surgery. Harrison delivered the words like a judge passing a lethal sentence. Derek let out a bitter, ugly scoff. "Vulnerable? Please. She's milking this stupid surgery like it makes her a helpless infant." I don't think he even realized how monstrous that sounded spoken aloud. Cruelty had become such a default reflex for him that he couldn't even hear his own venom anymore. "Say that exact phrase again," Harrison demanded, his voice suddenly dropping an octave into something terrifyingly lethal. Derek hesitated, swallowing hard. I said, "She's milking it." Harrison took one deliberate, slow step toward him. Fascinating. Because the official medical discharge papers I personally reviewed before offering her a ride home explicitly prohibited lifting, prolonged standing, and any unnecessary abdominal strain due to the high risk of internal hemorrhaging. If she had dragged herself to that stove for your dinner and collapsed, would you have dialed for an ambulance? Or would you have simply told the paramedics she was being dramatic too? Derek's jaw went completely slack. I had never witnessed anyone systematically dismantle him without raising their voice. It was disorienting, yet incredibly vindicating. Rachel capitalized on the dead silence. "Actually, there is one final piece of business," she announced, pulling a crisp final sheet of paper from the envelope. This bounced to the wrong contact email because Derek foolishly listed Clara's address as his secondary emergency contact on a corporate incident portal. Apparently, he authorized a massive vendor invoice last month that is currently under emergency internal review. Derek whipped around, panic finally shattering his arrogant facade. "Give me that." Rachel bypassed him entirely, and handed the document directly to Harrison. He scanned the text once. The entire molecular structure of the room shifted. This was no longer just a toxic domestic dispute. This was corporate collateral rot. "You forged a senior executive approval code?" Harrison asked, his tone deadly quiet. Derek's voice cracked with a desperate defensive squeak. "It was a logistical timing issue. Everyone in the department does it." Harrison looked up, his eyes entirely devoid of mercy. "No, Derek, everyone absolutely does not." The sharp buzz from Derek's phone vibrated against his thigh again. This time, even he looked terrified to check the screen. When he finally pulled it out, every last drop of blood drained from his face. He had been officially suspended, pending a full internal investigation. Effective immediately. Property access revoked. Digital credentials permanently disabled. He didn't need to read it aloud. The catastrophic ruin was written clearly in his hollow, defeated eyes. Derek was backed into a corner, his fragile corporate armor completely stripped away, leaving only the volatile, ugly core I had feared since childhood. Men who feed on absolute control rarely surrender without one final, desperate act of destruction. The only remaining question was how monstrous he was willing to become now that he realized there was no clean exit left. "You think this is funny?" he spat, not really speaking to me, but to the room, desperately trying to salvage some microscopic fragment of his shattered ego. "You're all standing here destroying my life over nothing." "Nothing?" I repeated, my voice dropping an octave. "You pillaged my bank account. You maliciously slandered me to the property managers. You sabotaged my credit score. You literally tried to force me to slave over a hot stove the very night I returned from major internal surgery. I made sacrifices too," he roared, taking a hostile heavy step toward me. "You think carrying you all these years has been a walk in the park?" Even caught dead to rights, tangled in his own web of undeniable evidence, he was instinctively reaching for his favorite worn-out script, the one where he was the noble, burdened martyr, and the misunderstood provider. It would have been comical if it hadn't cost me a decade of my life and sanity. "Carry me?" I echoed, the sheer audacity of his delusion fueling my spine. "You parasitized my paycheck. You used my name as a financial shield. You looted my literal medical recovery fund." "Watch your damn mouth," he snapped. Another heavy step brought him aggressively into my personal space. My traumatized nervous system bypassed my logical, empowered brain entirely. I flinched. I violently hated myself for it, but deeply ingrained trauma is always a fraction of a second faster than newfound pride. Derek caught the flinch and instantly mistook it for victory. His right hand twitched upward, not a fully cocked fist, but that familiar, terrifying phantom strike. The psychological weapon he used to remind me that he didn't necessarily need to hit me to prove that he possessed the power to do so. Harrison stepped squarely between us. He didn't move with dramatic, cinematic flair. He moved with the practiced, lethal efficiency of a man who absolutely controlled his physical environment. "Don't." Just that single, icy syllable. Derek froze instantly, not because his conscience magically woke up, but because the boundary line had finally been drawn by a predator significantly more powerful than him. Rachel was already anchoring my side, her arm slipping securely around my waist in a quiet show of absolute solidarity without making a spectacle of my vulnerability. Harrison didn't look away from Derek, but he addressed me. "Clara, has he utilized physical intimidation against you in the past?" The old, deeply conditioned reflex flared up: minimize the damage, soften the blow, don't make him angrier. But that cowardly reflex had nearly cost me my physical safety and my financial future. I forced myself to answer cleanly. "Yes," I stated, staring right at Derek, not always direct hitting, but trapping me in rooms, hovering over me, aggressively shattering dishes near my head, punching drywall to make sure I understood the physical threat. Derek screamed my name, but Harrison brutally cut across him. "Enough." Harrison withdrew his phone, tapped the screen, and placed a call on speaker. "Building security," he announced smoothly when the dispatch connected. "This is Harrison Vance, in Unit 4B. I require immediate physical assistance documenting the removal of an unauthorized occupant who has just engaged in severe verbal harassment and attempted physical intimidation against the legal tenant." Derek stared at him, his jaw going slack. "Unauthorized occupant?" Harrison glanced over his shoulder at me. Is his name anywhere on the official leasing paperwork? No, I replied smoothly. I never submitted the secondary occupant addendums. Derek let out a hysterical, disbelieving laugh, his eyes darting frantically around the room. You can't legally throw me out onto the street tonight. I reached into the narrow, brass-handled drawer of the hallway console table. My fingers were still trembling slightly, a potent, exhausting cocktail of physical pain and residual adrenaline. From beneath a stack of junk mail, I pulled out a crisp, heavy-stock manila folder containing utility records, lease addendums, and the one crucial document I had almost hidden from myself as much as from him: the absolute, undeniable certainty of my independence. Yes, I stated, my voice echoing clearly against the hardwood floor. I absolutely can. Saying those words out loud felt like taking a crowbar to a rusted, painted-shut window in a suffocating room that hadn't seen fresh air in a decade. Derek stared at the folder, then at my unyielding face. The horrifying realization finally dawned on his features that I had known far more than his ego allowed him to believe. You maliciously orchestrated all of this, he hissed. No, I replied smoothly. You simply made it physically and financially impossible for me to continue pretending you were a brother. Rachel handed me the final highlighted sheet from her envelope, the transfer summary detailing the stolen surgery funds. And I expect full legal restitution, I added, my tone strictly business. Every single dime, including the catastrophic damage you did to my credit score and the exorbitant late fees for the pain medication I was forced to delay because of your greed. He twisted his face into an ugly, desperate sneer. You honestly think any judge or cop is going to take your word over mine? Harrison stepped in flawlessly before I could even draw a breath. Her subpoenaed bank records will. Your employer's official suspension and pending fraud inquiry certainly will. The notarized lease will. And if you would like to continue debating this hypothetical scenario when the local police arrive, I am quite certain they will find your attempted physical assault from 2 minutes ago a highly relevant piece of context. I watched Derek completely run out of ammunition. The arrogant charm was dead. The aggressive posturing was useless. There was no private, isolated corner left where he could grind my reality down into dust. So, he reached for the most insidious, manipulative weapon remaining in his empty arsenal: blood. I'm your own flesh and blood, he pleaded, deliberately dropping his volume, attempting to counterfeit a vulnerable tenderness he didn't possess. You would really do this to your own family? I looked at him, and something fundamental inside my chest finally snapped not into sorrow or grief, but into crystalline, icy clarity. No, I answered softly. Family is just the pathetic, hollow word you weaponize when you want absolute forgiveness without an ounce of accountability. You stopped acting like my family a very long time ago. Building security arrived exactly 3 minutes later. 2 burly guards and the strict overnight manager stepped out of the elevator. They were instantly deferential when Harrison formally introduced himself, and entirely cooperative when I produced the notarized lease renewal signed months ago with my aunt's help bearing only my name as the sole legal tenant. Derek tried to argue, his voice shifting wildly from self-righteous outrage to a pathetic, wounded whine. But every syllable only shrank him further. The overnight manager coldly confirmed there had been multiple noise complaints filed against the unauthorized male occupant over the past year. Piece by piece, the parasitic infrastructure Derek had built his entire life upon was systematically dismantled. He was forced to aggressively shove his expensive suits and cologne into a canvas duffel bag under the watchful, unsympathetic eyes of the guards. Right before the elevator doors slid open to swallow him, he turned back one last time, desperately hoping to see me break, hoping for some old pathetic reflex of mercy he could exploit to gain re-entry. Instead, I simply maintained eye contact, reached for the heavy brass handle of my front door, and firmly pulled it shut. The metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place was a tiny sound, but to my ears it was the loudest, most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. I stood there for a few long, quiet seconds, my palm resting flat against the cool, solid wood of the front door. I was carefully breathing through the deep, radiating soreness in my abdomen, but simultaneously I felt an extraordinary, unfamiliar weightlessness expanding in my chest. Rachel exhaled first, breaking the heavy spell. Are you okay? She asked gently. I let out a soft, breathy laugh because okay was an incredibly inadequate word. I was physically battered. I was utterly exhausted. I was still harboring a deep, simmering fury for all the stolen years I could never get back. But humming quietly underneath all of that emotional wreckage, something incredibly bright, steady, and unbreakable had finally begun to rise. "I think," I murmured slowly, staring at the brass deadbolt, "this is the very first time I have ever actually been safe inside my own home." Rachel's fierce eyes immediately softened into pure warmth. Harrison, still standing respectfully near the entryway, granted me the kind of quiet, dignified distance people offer when they understand they have just witnessed something profoundly personal and life-altering. "Tomorrow morning," Harrison offered smoothly, his tone shifting back to calm professionalism, "I can have my corporate legal team connect you with a top-tier financial fraud specialist to properly document the entire theft and ensure complete, undeniable restitution. But only if you truly want to pursue that path." I looked at him, then at the damning paperwork still clutched in Rachel's hand, and finally around the apartment that suddenly felt expansive and clean without Derek's oppressive presence contaminating the oxygen. The profound silence in the room no longer felt like a terrifying threat I had to manage. It felt like a glorious prize I had rightfully earned. "I do want that," I answered with absolute certainty. "And I mean it. Not because I crave the petty thrill of vengeance, but because brutal consequences are exactly what the truth looks like when it finally stops apologizing for existing." Rachel gently pried the folder from my hands, opened the takeout container, and pressed a warm spoon into my palm. It felt incredibly surreal, as if we had merely survived a particularly nasty thunderstorm, instead of completely shattering a generational cycle of abuse in half. I sat down carefully at the kitchen island, the exact same spot where Derek had fully expected me to slave over a hot stove for him, and for the very first time in my adult life, I ate a quiet meal while someone else diligently made sure I rested. There were no barked orders, no subtle insults, no invisible current of terror humming underneath every movement. There was just quiet, steaming broth, undeniable proof of my independence, and the beautiful beginning of a life that no longer required my endless suffering to keep someone else perfectly comfortable. Later that evening, after Rachel had affectionately piled soft blankets on the sofa and Harrison had discreetly left his embossed business card on the counter, I slowly walked into the bathroom and looked at my reflection in the mirror. I fully expected to see a shattered woman, someone impossibly fragile, someone barely holding her fractured pieces together. Instead, staring back at me was a woman with deeply tired eyes, faded yellow hospital tape still clinging stubbornly to her pale skin, and a face that looked more fiercely honest than it had in a decade. True recovery, I realized in that quiet bathroom, wasn't merely about surgical staples closing physical incisions. Sometimes, it is about finally taking a scalpel to the toxic people who keep intentionally reopening the wound. At Karma's Coils, our dedicated team is profoundly passionate about crafting deeply meaningful, emotionally resonant, and empowering narratives that leave a lasting, positive imprint on our listeners. We are firmly committed to making it crystal clear that while every gripping story on this channel is a fictionalized creation, they are meticulously designed to share vital educational lessons, highlight positive moral values, and provide incredibly useful psychological insights with our wonderful audience. Our female protagonist handled her terrifying ordeal with remarkable courage, unwavering self-respect, and incredibly calm strength, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that standing tall in your own truth can be infinitely more powerful than suffering in silence. Her brave choice serves as a beautiful, striking reminder that firmly setting your boundaries is almost always the absolute first step toward genuine healing and true justice. If you found yourself completely trapped in Clara's shoes, facing a lifetime of manipulation masked as family, how would you have handled that final, explosive confrontation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Karma's Coils for more stories of justice, truth, and resilience.